They say time dulls the edges of a mistake, softens it until it feels less like a wound and more like a scar. But some mistakes remained sharp, even years later. Marrying Richard was one of those. I was 29 when I first met him, tired, uncertain, and hopeful in the way only someone from a poor family could be.
He was charming.
Wealthy. He made a simple girl from the wrong side of the tracks feel like she mattered. Diamonds instead of daisies. Business class instead of buses. And for a while I believed that meant something.
He said he loved me.
I wanted to believe him. Maybe I did. But the truth? He didn't love me. He purchased me. Now, a decade later, I sit in silence in a house too large for its own good, staring at walls that reflect nothing of me. Richard, at 52, is still powerful, still respected in the business world, still surrounded by admirers. But none of them are me. He stopped seeing me years ago. The gifts dwindled. The conversations dried up. The touches became rare, then non-existent. I became a figure in his household, a wife by title, a stranger in his eyes. What's worse is that I accepted it. I let the silence settle in like dust, coating every corner of our life together. Until that morning, the door opened, and I heard the sound of a suitcase being set down in the foyer. It had been so long since anyone arrived with that kind of presence. I was halfway through my tea, sitting at the breakfast nook, when I turned and saw him. Jason, his son from a previous marriage, 22 now, freshly returned from Thailand. The last time I saw him, he was barely out of high school, still holding the awkwardness of youth in his shoulders. But now he stood taller, his skin kissed by the sun, his expression softer than his father's, but his eyes were steady, observant. "Hi," he said, his voice lower, warmer than I remembered. "Welcome home," I replied, unsure of what else to say. He smiled, and for the first time in years, someone really looked at me. Not through me, not past me, at me. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time.
Seen.
Jason had only been home for a day when I realized how different it felt to have him in the house. The silence that usually pressed down on me like thick velvet had shifted. It wasn't loud, no, not in the traditional sense. It was subtler. There was movement, energy. A warm breath in a place that had been cold for too long. He didn't ask many questions, but he noticed things. Like how I didn't eat much during dinner, or how I always filled Richard's glass first, never my own. He watched me carefully, not in a way that made me uneasy, but as if he were slowly trying to understand the shape of my life here. His father barely acknowledged us at the table. "Jason, there's a networking event next week. You should come. I'll introduce you to the people who matter," Richard said, cutting into his steak, without looking up. Jason wiped his mouth with his napkin and met my eyes briefly before replying.
"Sure, Dad.
But first I want to settle and maybe spend time with people who already matter." Richard didn't catch the nuance. He never did. After dinner, Jason helped me with the dishes. A simple thing. Small. But it meant more to me than I could explain. No one had done that in this house. Ever. "Is he always like that?" he asked quietly as he handed me a plate. I hesitated. "Like what?" He smirked. "So used to being the son, he forgets other people have warmth too." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. That night, as I climbed into bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought of the way Jason had looked at me when he said those words. Thought of how his hand brushed against mine when we reached for the same dish towel. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. But still, I slept with a strange tightness in my chest, like something had cracked open. The next few days passed like a slow ripple across still water. Jason made himself comfortable in the house in a way that felt both effortless and quietly rebellious. He didn't ask permission. He didn't tiptoe. And somehow, his presence began to fill spaces that had long since gone cold. He started joining me for morning tea. I always brewed a second cup now, one for him, one for me. We'd sit on the back patio in silence sometimes, listening to the birds, watching the leaves move gently with the wind. Sometimes he'd talk about Thailand, about the people he'd met, the things he'd seen. He never spoke about his father. One morning, as I sat with my hands wrapped around my mug, Jason asked, "Do you ever wish you'd chosen differently?" I turned to him, startled by the sudden intimacy of the question. "You mean not marrying your father?" His gaze didn't waver. "I mean choosing what you wanted instead of what felt safe." I looked down, unsure how to answer. He continued, softer now. "You don't have to tell me. I see you. You know." That quiet admission struck something deep inside me. Later that evening, Richard confronted Jason. I overheard it from the hallway. "She's my wife," he hissed, his voice sharp and low. "I don't want you getting too comfortable around her. You hear me?" Jason didn't raise his voice. "She's a human being, not your possession." There was a long silence. Then the sound of Richard's heavy steps retreating. That night, Jason knocked on my door. Just once. He didn't enter. He didn't need to. "I'm sorry if I made things harder for you," he said from the other side. "You didn't," I whispered. The next day, we started meeting in secret. Not because we had something to hide. Not yet. But because when someone sees you, truly sees you, you want to hold on to that as long as you can. Even if it means hiding from the rest of the world. It started with books. Jason had found my old collection in the library. Dusty paperbacks, pages yellowed with time. Titles I hadn't touched since I first moved into this house. "You read all these?" he asked, thumbing through the worn spine of a poetry volume. I nodded from across the room, folding laundry. Before I forgot how. He tilted his head. "How do you forget?" "When no one asks you what you love anymore," I said simply. He didn't reply, but the next morning, a book sat on my bedside table. A novel I'd once mentioned in passing, long out of print. He had found it. He remembered. We never said anything about it, but something shifted. A shared quiet, more intimate than touch. One rainy afternoon, the house hushed under the soft percussion of water against the windows. I found him in the kitchen cooking. He had flour on his cheek, sleeves rolled to his elbows, humming to himself. "You're cooking?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. He grinned. "I figured I'd give you a night off. You look tired." Tired. It wasn't the word for it. I was worn, hollowed out. But for the first time in years, someone had seen it. And done something. We sat at the table. Just the two of us. Rain drumming a soft rhythm behind us. He poured wine. Lit a candle. A dinner more tender than any I'd had with his father. "Tell me something you've never said out loud," he asked, his voice low and honest. I paused, fingers wrapped around the glass. "I used to want to be an artist. Before life made other plans." He reached across the table, his fingers brushing mine. Not a grab. Not a bold gesture. Just contact. Human and gentle. "You still can," he said. It was nothing. And everything. Because in that moment, I forgot the rules. And remembered who I was before I became someone's forgotten wife. The days stretched into a rhythm I hadn't expected. Jason made the house feel alive. He'd find reasons to linger in the rooms I occupied. Folding laundry together, helping me prep vegetables for dinner, or just leaning against the counter while I made my morning tea. We never spoke of his father's warnings again. We didn't need to. The walls already knew. What grew between us didn't erupt, it unfolded. One afternoon, I was in the garden pruning the rose bushes. My gloves were thick, the sun hot on my neck, but I found peace in the ritual of it. I didn't hear Jason approach until I caught his shadow. "You're bleeding," he said gently, and I looked down to see a thin cut across the back of my hand, a thorn having sliced through. "It's nothing," I said, brushing it off. He crouched beside me, taking my wrist. I froze. His touch was careful, steady, like I was something fragile and sacred all at once. He took out a handkerchief, who even carried those anymore, and wrapped it around my hand. "You always pretend things don't hurt," he said, not as a judgment, but a fact. "I've had practice." He tied the knot gently, then looked up at me. Our eyes locked, and I felt it again, that breathless, weightless pause where everything around us stopped moving. I stood too quickly, dizzy from more than just the heat. "Thank you," I murmured, retreating toward the house. Inside, I leaned against the doorframe, hand pressed to my chest, trying to quiet the storm building inside me. Later that evening, we sat in the living room, a movie playing but neither of us watching it. I felt his eyes flicker to me more than once. I tried to ignore it, tried to keep my attention on the screen. "You're not happy," he said suddenly, not as a question. I glanced at him, startled by the bluntness. "You pretend well, but I see it," he continued. "I saw it the moment I walked back into this house. You're not living. You're surviving." The truth of his words was a blade softened only by the kindness in his voice. "What do you want from me, Jason?" I whispered. "Nothing," he said. "I just want you to remember who you were before all of this." I turned to face him fully. "That woman doesn't exist anymore." "She does," he said, his voice low. "I see her every time you smile, when you think no one's looking. Every time you lose yourself in a book or laugh at something stupid I say." His words wrapped around me like warm water, drawing me closer to something dangerous and beautiful. "Jason," I said, trying to pull away from the cliff edge we both stood on. But then, lightning cracked across the sky outside, and the lights flickered. A second later, the power went out. "Oh," I breathed, sitting up straighter. "Don't move," he said. "I'll get the candles." A few minutes later, he returned with a small cluster of flickering flames. The room bathed in golden shadows. He handed me one, his fingers lingering around mine longer than they should have. We sat like that, the movie forgotten, the quiet thick with unsaid things. And then he asked, "What would you do if no one was watching?" "I don't know anymore," I admitted. "You'd dance barefoot," he said. "You'd paint. You'd lie in the grass and laugh too loud. You'd kiss someone because you wanted to." My breath caught. His words weren't an invitation. They were a reflection. Still, something inside me stirred. And I realized I wanted all of it. Not just the quiet and the care. Not just being seen. I wanted to feel again. That night, I couldn't sleep. The storm outside mirrored the one inside me. I stepped into the hallway, barefoot, my silk robe tied loosely around me. The moonlight streamed through the skylight, and I padded softly toward the kitchen.
He was there.
Of course he was. He turned, his face illuminated by the glow from the open fridge. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. I shook my head. "Storm." He handed me a glass of water, his fingers brushing mine again, this time on purpose. He didn't step back. Neither did I. We stood in the glow of the refrigerator like moths lured by the same flame. Slowly, so slowly, he reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. "You're beautiful," he whispered. "Don't," I said, though I didn't move. "Why not?" His voice was a low ache. "You think it's wrong?" I opened my mouth, but no sound came. And then, like breath-breaking surface, he leaned in. Not fast, not selfish, but like someone who knew this moment would change everything and wanted to remember the way it felt forever. He didn't kiss me. He almost did. And in the heartbeat before our lips met, we heard a sound.
Keys.
The front door. His father was home. I stepped back, heart hammering. Jason cursed under his breath and turned off the fridge light. We stood frozen in the darkness, the storm echoing against the windows and inside our chests. We hadn't done anything, but it had already happened. The line had been crossed. Not with touch, but with truth. and there was no going back. Richard didn't stay long, and that, in itself, had become a pattern more familiar than I ever cared to admit. He returned home late that night, the scent of rain clinging to his coat, his presence filling the space with something cold and heavy rather than warm and reassuring. He kissed my cheek absent-mindedly, a brief, indifferent gesture that landed more on the air than my skin, and walked past Jason without so much as a nod. Within moments, he had vanished into his study, the door closing with a quiet finality that felt like it belonged more to a stranger than a husband. The morning after his return, Jason and I moved around each other as though the house had suddenly become a tightrope we were both afraid to fall from. There was no eye contact, no shared smiles, only an unspoken understanding that something had shifted between us, and neither of us knew how to name it aloud. The night before, we had stood on the edge of something immense, something that, had we taken one step further, would have changed everything. That kiss, so close, so charged, had hovered in the space between our breaths like a promise we weren't ready to make. Jason left the house not long after breakfast without a word, disappearing into the city like a man searching for clarity, and I spent the hours wandering aimlessly through the house that had never quite felt like mine. My hands traced the backs of chairs, the cool marble counters, the spines of old books I hadn't opened in years, all of it haunted now by the quiet memory of him, his voice, his gaze, the way his fingers brushed mine as he handed me a glass of water under the faint blue glow of the refrigerator light. When he returned later that evening, the tension between us hadn't dissipated. If anything, it had deepened, coiled tighter around our silence. He found me in the same place he always did, on the back patio, book open in my lap, my eyes reading the same paragraph over and over but absorbing none of it. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, steady and unhurried, as though he already knew where to find me. "You didn't run," he said, his voice quiet and laced with something almost like awe. I looked up, blinking against the fading light. Should I have? A soft smile played on his lips, the kind that wasn't about amusement, but understanding. Most people would have. I returned my gaze to the page I hadn't been reading and let the silence stretch for a while, the kind of silence that didn't demand to be filled. "I'm tired of running," I said finally, and he nodded as though I had just confirmed something he had long suspected. That evening, we talked, not just in the polite, surface-level way people do when they're trying to fill the space, but in the deep, unraveling way that peels back layers neither of us had ever shown another person. I told him about the beginning, about Richard's whirlwind courtship, the expensive dresses, the dinners in penthouse restaurants, the overwhelming sense that I'd stepped into someone else's life. I told him how it had all faded like perfume on silk, the attention, the warmth, the sense of being wanted. I told him that the gifts didn't stop, but the affection did, and how somewhere along the way, I had stopped asking for more because I stopped believing I deserved it. Jason didn't interrupt. He didn't offer comfort or advice. He simply listened, the kind of listening that felt like presence more than response, like stillness wrapped in understanding. When I finally looked at him, his eyes were fire, not anger, but something more focused and protective, something that made me want to fall forward and never look back. "You don't belong to him," he said, his voice low and sure. I let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though there was nothing humorous in it. "Legally, I do." He didn't hesitate. "Not your soul." 2 days later, Richard left again, another emergency, this time in Geneva, and as he zipped his suitcase, he reminded me, in that cold, clipped tone of his, to keep Jason in check. "Don't let the boy get too comfortable," he said, eyes glinting with suspicion disguised as control. "He forgets his place." I didn't reply. I simply watched him walk out the door, watched the car pull away, and felt something inside me loosen, not with rebellion, but with truth. That night, when Jason came to me, there was no knocking, no questions. He stood in the doorway of my room, a silhouette against the faint glow of the hallway light, and asked quietly, "Can I come in?" I said yes, and he crossed the space slowly, deliberately, every step weighted with something deeper than desire, something like inevitability. He stopped in front of me, and I could feel my breath catch as he reached for my hand, holding it, not possessively, but like someone touching something sacred, something that needed to be honored, not claimed. "I don't know where this goes," I whispered, the words trembling between fear and longing. "And I don't know how to stop it." "Then don't," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, only a certainty that made the moment feel like it was unfolding outside of time. When he kissed me, it was slow, deliberate, and full of every unspoken word we hadn't dared say until now. His lips were soft, tentative at first, as though asking a question, and when I didn't pull away, the kiss deepened with aching reverence. It wasn't a kiss of conquest or temptation. It was a kiss of rediscovery, of life pushing its way through the cracks of everything I had buried. And when he finally pulled back, resting his forehead gently against mine, he whispered, "Tell me to stop." But I couldn't, because I didn't want to. Because for the first time in years, I felt more than just alive. I felt whole.